So we're going to start talking about gymnosperms. And when we think about gymnosperms, a lot of times you'll think about things like pine trees, these kind of evergreen, big, tall trees that dominate our high elevations in Utah here and are planted quite commonly and are associated with a lot of our cultural practices, like things like Christmas in particular. But this kind of idea that these pine trees are these evergreen trees and they represent the majority of gymnosperms really hides the truth about gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are ancient lineage that have a lot of really interesting diversity both in the past and in the present and do a lot of kind of magnificent things that really set the tone for almost all of our modern plant lineages that we see today. The gymnosperms are a huge clade of organisms that are fairly poorly represented with extant plants, but they represent an important sister clade to the flowering plants, the angiosperms, which we'll be moving more to in a couple weeks. They represent a monophyletic group, so they all share a core common ancestor that was the first gymnosperm that gave rise to all these other groups. And they come in 5 primary orders. The Psychedales, which are a group of mainly tropically distributed plants that have these kind of palm-like fronds to them, that you commonly see them sold as in garden stores as a house plant occasionally. The order Ginkgoales, which is represented only by one extant species currently, which is a common plant that's planted on our campus in a lot of cities throughout the world, but it has a very narrow restrictive native range, and whether or not it actually exists in the wild is subject to some debate. We have the Nitales, which includes a very strange group that is associated only with the Namibia desert in Africa. And then our common Pineales, which includes the pine trees and things like spruces and firs as well, that grow these kind of woody classic cones to them that we'd like to decorate our houses with. And then the Cupressales, which around here include our junipers, which get cones, but these cones are actually fleshy cones. But the unique thing about all these gymnosperms, which are going to be different than any of the plants that we've talked about so far in this class, is that these are going to be the first group that have seeds to them. They're not going to do their reproduction via spores that we've talked about all the other organisms so far. In fact, their name gymnosperm comes from the literally means naked seeds. And what they mean by that is in comparison to the angiosperms, the flowering plants that we'll be taking up in a few weeks. Gymnosperm seed is not enclosed in a structure or an ovary in this. And so it gives it this kind of more raw, kind of on its own appearance, and not have kind of the fruit structures that flowering plants will have. These seeds generally develop directly on kind of modified scales, so such as pine cones, or right on the leaves themselves of those plants, like ginkgos do. And these are usually highly modified, either into cones of some sort, but a lot of times a lot of these lineages just kind of put their seed out into the world and let it to develop right on their body, unlike the angiosperms, which have these large complex structures that we call fruit. And these different modifications to these seeds is really important in looking at these different groups of gymnosperms. When we look through the phylogeny of the gymnosperms, we see a lot of modification in how these seeds are developed on the plants. And all these lineages that the gymnosperms represent are all pretty modern plants. Relatively in this time scale of Earth, a lot of them have evolved and diversified recently. And a lot of them have very high levels of specialization to the habitats they grow in. And because of this, almost every one of these lineages has kind of, or has had at one point in human history, really important economic importance. In fact, most of our wood industry is driven by gymnosperms. A lot of spices, especially those that flavor products like gin, come from the Cupressales and the junipers. And they have a lot of important cultural and historic kind of uses. For instance, ginkgos, and then ephedra, also one of the common names for it, Mormon tea, is very culturally relevant to us in Utah here. The reason why we kind of consider gymnosperms a really modern lineage is because they are the first lineage to develop seeds. And the revolution that happened when seeds evolved in the plant lineage has ramifications to this day, because seeds allowed a vast opening of a lot of new ways to kind of live your life and reproduce. You didn't have to worry about complex life cycles with spores, or you didn't have to worry about those spores just finding the perfect place to land. In fact, if you had a bad year, seeds are really good at kind of extending that life through time, because these seeds can go be dormant. It also allows them to fill much new niches. Spores are kind of up to whatever kind of way the wind blows or the water flows, whereas seeds are being able to kind of not only just blow around with the wind, but also animals can take advantage of them and move them around. So this led to a lot of new biogeographic distributions of a lot of the gymnosperms once they finally developed. And even to this extent today, a lot of these gymnosperms have really unique ways to protect and propagate their seeds. For instance, jack pine, which is a very common tree from where I grew up in Michigan, has these very hard closed cones. And they need fire to open up. They need catastrophic fire, actually, to burn down their whole stands. And only with that very intense fire will these cones open. And these seeds then will have a nice open, freshly burned area where they can germinate and start growing again. The other really unique thing we start to see in gymnosperms is their pollination system. Because they have these kind of true seeds, what we see is a lot of times these gymnosperms will have separate male and female cones. And what will happen is that these gymnosperms will generally be wind pollinated, though there are some notable exceptions to that. And so a lot of times you'll see, and especially this time of year, these huge clouds of pollen coming off of these gymnosperms. And what they're hoping is that the wind will kind of be able to randomly flow them and hit a female cone. So the seed cones are generally much bigger on these plants because their job is to try to collect all this pollen that's flowing off. When I lived in Mississippi, during this time of year, it was kind of neon yellow year. Every time you went out, your whole cars, everything would be covered in this neon yellow pollen from all the loblolly pine we had growing locally to us. And so by putting out these masses of pollen, gymnosperms can try to hopefully assure pollination of these female cones. But it's really important to note that not all gymnosperms are wind pollinated. In particular, the cycad lineage can be insect pollinated. Some of our modern cycads are, especially the orders thrips and beetles, tend to be very attracted to these cones and are really good at moving pollen from flower to flower within these cones. And this kind of has been a really close area of interest to a lot of evolutionary biologists, especially when we consider how insect pollination started to occur and the eventual evolution of flowers. And so the cycad lineage has been really the ground zero in looking at this. Recently, we were able to find some ancient cycad fossils that luckily for us, for some reason, got preserved, and we were able to find insects from way back in the beginning of the Jurassic period crawling around in these structures. And these are kind of decided that they're probably one of the earliest form of insect pollination. Especially as we see a lot of these kind of early beetles have very specialized mouth parts that we think were able to specifically get into specific species of cycads to pollinate them. It's thought that they might also not be actually going in there to get things like nectar or sugars or anything, because these lack these nectary glands like angiosperms do, but these beetles might have been rooting around to try to actually eat the pollen themselves, and kind of coevolution took off from there, and gave us the flowering plant orders later on. The other big thing we see with gymnosperms is that all of our extant gymnosperms are woody plants. And this woodiness is where we actually start to see true wood develop. So we talked about the Lycopodia having kind of secondary xylem, but we didn't see kind of the hard woodiness that we have in the gymnosperms. And gymnosperms accomplish this, like those members of Lycopodia, through this process called secondary growth. And what secondary growth is a synapomorphy of all the seed plants. So gymnosperms and angiosperms all have secondary growth. And so it's a trait that unites these two groups as a good monophyletic group. And the secondary growth likely predates the evolution of seeds. And so this is probably a kind of a requirement to start growing seeds, these big structures that are energy intense. In the process of secondary growth occurs, so the plant will put down what we call primary growth, which is kind of its regular stem tissue with all of its cells. And in secondary growth, those cells end up getting reinforced by things, such as the deposition of lignin or tannins into these cells to make them hard and give that plant strong structural support to it. Also is probably an anti-herbivory defense. At the same time, we still have primary growth occurring, and that's going to start to push out the secondary growth. And this kind of transition between primary to secondary to primary to secondary is what in the end is going to give us our tree rings that we see today when we cut down a tree. Wood was also a significant adaptation for gymnosperms that likely allowed them to spread. In fact, gymnosperms today are dominant members of many communities that we look at. All you have to do is hike up one of our mountains here along the Wasatch Front, and you'll see that you're all of a sudden in a community dominated by gymnosperms. And in fact, this woodiness is so strong in a lot of these plants that some of our largest organisms on Earth, if not the largest organisms on Earth, are woody plants. Especially things like coastal redwoods, giant sequoias, and even things like Douglas fir can get to massive heights, and it's all thanks to this woodiness that they have. So a quick review is that there's 5 major clades of gymnosperms, and those 5 clades are a really strong monophyletic group of woody seed plants. And these are the first big plants to have seeds, and it's really one of the reasons why gymnosperms have been such a historically successful group of plants, but also continue to persist today. As well as we see wood being a major adaptation in them, allowing them to stay successful and spread across the globe. And we also see very kind of distinct mating systems happen because of these separate male-female reproductive tissues on these plants. No conversation about gymnosperms would be complete unless we considered kind of their evolution and where they're coming from. In fact, today, most of our gymnosperms that we have running around were likely to get munched on by these guys, because during the time of the dinosaurs, most of our modern gymnosperm lineages were extant and on this planet. So if you're in a pine forest and looking around, there's a good chance that a lot of the organisms you see are going to be organisms that this guy right here saw at the time. The rise of the gymnosperms is really the story about the rise of seed plants in general. And this happened during the late Carboniferous, is when we started seeing a lot of gymnosperms starting to take over the fossil record. In these gymnosperms, we think that during the late Carboniferous, as the lycopode forests were kind of the dominant organism, with the advent of these seeded plants, they started to outcompete and replace these large lycopode forests. We also saw at this kind of late time period change sudden environmental changes as well, that we call the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. At this time, the world started becoming a much cooler and drier place. And these lycopodes that had evolved in these kind of grand rainforests really couldn't keep up with these changes. But these seeded gymnosperms were able to do that. And so we saw the world transitioning from these dense carboniferous rainforests into these kind of more open, gymnosperm-dominated habitats. We also saw at this time, which we think was happening, is that these seeds were able to not only better exploit these environments of this changing earth, but we saw really important genetic changes into this plant. And most importantly, we see right around in here, we believe, a doubling of chromosome counts. That probably allowed those spores to have more material around them that gave rise to what would end up being a seed. Really, though, the Jurassic period is where we see the kind of the golden age of gymnosperms. So when you're looking at things like movies like Jurassic Park, not only do they get many of the dinosaurs wrong, but they also get a lot of the plants wrong, because this was really the time of cycads and ginkgos that dominated the planet. The Permian was also a really important phase for them, where we started to see a lot of these plants develop. But really, by the Jurassic period, we saw many of our extant relatives of the gymnosperms were active on this planet. In fact, if you look at Brachiosaurus and you look at our modern pine trees, Brachiosaurus would probably get up every day and eat some of our modern pine trees. So the pine trees on your way to school, for instance, are the same ones or related to something that was getting attacked by these massive dinosaurs. But of course, our world's not dominated by gymnosperms anymore. Though we have lots of gymnosperm representatives, they're really kind of not that diverse and pretty small group overall when considering extant alive relatives today. And this downfall of the gymnosperm world that they had dominated really happened during the start of the Cretaceous. Because at the end of the Cretaceous period, angiosperms all of a sudden had become the dominant plant. It almost happened overnight in geological time. And there's been a lot of issues of why this could have happened. One of the big reasons that people say is that fruit and flowers are just really good organs to have, and they're a lot better, angiosperms are just better able to outcompete gymnosperms. We also saw during this time period a kind of more cooling of the earth that happened. And so as we had the earth's biotic environment start to get shaked up, new ways to survive these kind of new ecological conditions needed to come across to start these lineages. But again, we have a lot of gymnosperms on our planet. All you have to do is take a hike up a mountain and you're going to be in a conifer-dominated forest. And the big going theory is that gymnosperms were able to survive by kind of specializing on habitats that angiosperms might not have been able to get there. One of the reasons why you have to go up in elevation to get to gymnosperms, or some of our gymnosperms are associated only in dry tropical areas or extreme deserts. And this has been kind of modeled quite a bit and looked at a lot. And we see kind of that gymnosperm clades stopped diversifying toward this, whereas angiosperms, kind of more toward present, started to diversify quite a bit at the expense of higher extinction rates of gymnosperms in the fossil record. So it's pretty much been assumed now that these gymnosperms are kind of relics and are hiding in these kind of very specialized environments away from competing with the gymnosperms. But it really hasn't been a big deal for a lot of gymnosperms. In fact, one of the amazing things about all these old lineages of gymnosperms is that we have these great fossil records, but we've actually been able to rediscover some of these lineages. Probably the most amazing example of this is the Wollemi pine, which was rediscovered very recently in Australia in 1994. A Park Service employee for the Australian Park Service was hiking in these canyons in the Australian outback, and he found some plants that he saw no analog to. He brought them back, and some museum curators were looking at it and thought, man, this looks incredibly like a fossil I saw one time. And so they got some paleobotanists up, and they were amazed that this extant living tree was almost directly from these fossils. And Walmy pine represented a group of extinct plants that we had known for a long time, but just assumed that they had gone extinct. In fact, one of the researchers that worked on this, and I think he hit it right on the head, was this is the botanical equivalent of us finding a dinosaur that is alive. So like a mini Tyrannosaurus Rex essentially running around, we rediscovered that in the botany world. These canyons are really highly protected, and even to this day, the locations of Walmy pine is very kind of kept under covers. In fact, during the Australian fires recently, these canyons were highly threatened, and the Australian government had a massive mobilization to prevent these areas from burning down. Luckily for us, one of the things we first did is we grabbed seed, and now it's a widely available plant in cultivation. And the money from those seeds has gone to protecting this literal Jurassic Park that we have on our planet. And this story of kind of rediscovery isn't something that's been fairly unique to the Gymnosperms. A lot of our other lineages have been rediscovered. In the 1940s in China, we rediscovered the dawn redwood, or metasequoia, which again was a plant that we only knew from fossil recordings, and then we rediscovered in a small grove in China. Even today, these are considered critically endangered in the wild, and they face a massive threat, especially as China industrializes and expands into a lot of these wild areas. But again, it's been another tree that we've been able to bring into horticulture and try to preserve in case we lose these wild populations, as an important linkage to understanding plants that had evolved in the ancient past and with extant fossil records of them. When I lived in San Francisco, one of my favorite places to go was underneath a dawn redwood growing in the Botanic Garden in the middle of the city. So when we think about fossil plants and survivors, really the poster child for all these is Ginkgo biloba. The Ginkgo alleles used to be an extremely diverse group that was likely represented by hundreds of fossils that we know of. And we've described multiple different species that come from strata that have origins all across Earth. And this supergroup really was kind of, we believe, the dominant fossil group of these kind of weird deciduous-leafed gymnosperms. But today, this group is only represented by a single species, Ginkgo biloba, which now, thanks to some of its qualities, is widely distributed back across the globe, especially as a street planting tree. And this kind of ginkgo tree really represents kind of the ultimate survivability, and has probably a lot of reasons why it kind of made it into the modern world. But before we talk about kind of why it was able to survive in the modern world, one of the reasons why it's been so widely distributed now is because it is an incredibly tenacious plant. The Ginkgo biloba itself has many attractive qualities to it as a planted tree. In fact, it really started in kind of during the World War in Japan, when we realized that a lot of these trees can survive massive trauma to them. In fact, in Nagasaki and Hiroshima today, many trees, many ginkgos in particular, that survived the atomic bombings actually have special names to them and have been preserved in kind of memorial to those events. They're also able to survive pollution quite well. And they can take kind of the exhaust and day-to-day air pollutions that we find in cities. So for instance, in the Utah Valley area, these trees can kind of shrug off our poor air quality, and a lot of them can do quite fine. Interestingly about the ginkgos is that the ginkgos have these weird fleshy cones to them. In fact, if you've ever gone by a female tree and seen some of these fleshy cones, you probably got a bad whiff of something. And I like to describe that these cones smell like they look like. They look like kind of these gross, pustular little blister things. And they really do smell that. And one of the things that a lot of botanists have kind of tried to conjecture about these plants is what would love to eat these kind of gross smelling things. And it's been thought that these gross smelling things attracted actual dinosaurs to these trees. And the dinosaurs would crawl up in the trees and just knock the tree over to get to these seeds. They would ingest these seeds and later on poop them out and help this tree spread. But these trees are so tenacious that getting knocked over is not a big deal to them. They're able to just re-sprout right away. When I was in high school, I planted a ginkgo in my backyard because I just thought they looked pretty cool. But when I went away to college, my parents decided to replace me with a new dog. That dog went out its first day in the backyard and started to just chew on that ginkgo and actually destroyed it, girdling the tree. And that ginkgo, though, is still alive today. It immediately just resprouted, put up a new leading trunk, and even the subsequent moves that my parents have gone through when they've dug up that plant and moved it to a new house, that ginkgo has been doing fine to this day. And it's really a testament to this kind of unusual life cycle and hardiness that these trees have had. And because of this hardiness, these trees have really kind of captured historically kind of our cultural sensibilities, especially where ginkgo biloba is thought to be kind of remnant in Eastern Asia. And because of this, ginkgos have become these very important horticultural examples, especially for cultural significance. The symbol of Tokyo is a green ginkgo leaf, highly stylized. And even in Buddhism in particular, ginkgo trees have been sort of prized for their very kind of unusual life cycle where they drop their branches for the winter and then grow back those leaves and have these magnificent displays. In fact, some people believe that one of the reasons why ginkgos didn't go extinct was because of this horticulture practice of planting a ginkgo tree within the temple grounds. But there is some debate of that because we do know of a stand in China that's thought to be a naturally occurring stand of ginkgo trees. And then lastly, as we've mentioned, that these trees are very prized for horticultures, especially the male varieties, because they don't get those kind of disgusting smelling female cones on them. And lastly, with all these, ginkgo has also been kind of incorporated as a food and in kind of modern food movements or new age remedies as a supplement. Food has traditionally been very kind of as a just kind of a special treat or kind of a side dish to these things, because ginkgo seeds can be fairly toxic if you eat them in high doses, and they can cause a lot of metabolic issues as well as important nerve damage if you eat too much of them. One of the dishes that we see is most commonly is traditional New Year's Eve dishes, especially porridges from China. Interestingly, though, in the trade, there's been a lot of kind of conjecture and research that ginkgo might be kind of a memory boosting substance to eat. And so you can find small doses of it almost everywhere, of these ginkgo biloba tabs. Whether or not they actually work is a very open question, and it's likely that they really don't improve your memory that much, but a lot of people would really like these kind of solutions to these problems. And the last thing I want to put out there is that we have all these kind of extinct plants that we've rediscovered over the years. And even in our backyard here in North America, we have species of conifers that existed at one point and are gone now. This is Picea critchfieldii, or Critchfield spruces, which was an extant species in the southeast United States during the Pleistocene period. And it kind of disappeared from the fossil record really fast at the end of the Pleistocene, right when humans first got to North America and we saw the decline in the megafauna. And to this day, there is, believe it or not, a lot of unexplored kind of small areas in the southeastern United States. And I think it's an open question whether or not, maybe the next Walmy pine is hidden in our backyard.